Marandi. He is a professor at Tehran University. Hopefully we have him. There he is. Thanks so much for speaking to us. First, if you can give us your idea of where you think this discrepancy is coming from in the numbers between Amnesty International's latest report and the official numbers that Tehran is putting out, that only 5 people have been killed versus 100.
Well, Iran never gave such a figure. At least 5 police officers and officers patrolling the streets have been killed. And so maybe there's a confusion in the number. But this is definitely not an uprising. Even in the clips that you've just shown, you don't see large numbers of people. These were very well-organized groups. They were very well equipped. They were very efficient. Within less than 48 hours, they destroyed 300 banks. And obviously the assets were taken in many occasions, in most occasions. They destroyed tens of public buses, tens of ambulances, over 100 petrol stations. And they were egged on by Persian language media that is broadcast from the West, both public funded, such as the BBC Persian and VOA, as well as those that are private but funded by Western government. So the protests actually existed on the first day in different cities, but those were peaceful. And then the rioters came in, and these well-organized groups. The protesters quickly left the scene because they knew what was happening, and for 2 days we had real violence. These people were carrying swords, they were carrying iron bars, and many of them also had weapons.
Okay. You can take issue with, the people that the officials are describing as the rioters and whose actions you've described and obviously condemned. That's understandable, but these protests are really part of a series of protests that have been taken to the streets now for years. Public discontent over government action, this latest being the rise in fuel price. Just tell us if anything is actually being done to recognize the legitimate concerns of these protesters who are struggling with daily life in Iran. Or is the country just going to continue to say that all those protests are acting at the behest of foreign powers?
No, no one in Iran said the protests are acting at the behest of foreign powers. No official has said that whatsoever. In fact,
they have always said that there is foreign interference.
Both the administration, as well as the opponents of the administration, parliamentarians, no, they did not say anything about the protesters. They were talking about the rioters. You have to make a distinction. There were the protesters that we had in large numbers in different cities on day 1, but they disappeared on day 2. And on day 2, the violence began. And there were small groups that were all over different cities, groups of 50, 100, 150 here and there, very well organized, very well trained, and very well equipped.
Okay.
Some of them would take out banks in
I understand. So
10 to 20 minutes.
You are drawing a distinction there.
Bank. But I would also like to, so the government, no, I'm saying the government and the opposition, parliament, everyone draws a clear distinction.
Understood.
And many are criticizing the government for the way in which this was carried out. But of course, I also have to point out about Amnesty International, that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they are closely associated with the U.S. government. The former head of Amnesty USA was a very close friend of Hillary Clinton. Amnesty International, during a NATO conference in Chicago, they invited Madeleine Albright as their keynote speaker. She was the same person who, when asked about 500 Iraqis dying due to the sanctions and whether it was a price worth paying, she said it was. So Amnesty, when it comes to human rights, is very biased.
I understand your issues with Amnesty. I want to get back on the track of what the government is actually doing to recognize the protesters that you also deem legitimate, with legitimate complaints. What is being done to address their demands?
Well, again, I'm not in the government. I'm just saying that that is what the government has been saying. But the fuel hikes The reason why they're being carried out is because fuel in Iran was 8 cents a liter, and that caused huge amounts of fuel to be smuggled outside of the country, because the price, for example, in Turkey is almost, I think, 24 times as much as Iran. And so public assets were being taken out of the country. On the other hand, fuel consumption was on the rise, and Iran, at this rate, because it was so cheap, was going to become a net exporter of fuel, and the government was afraid that the U.S. would use that as leverage to prevent Iran from importing fuel. So the government did raise the price, but what it said is that all the earnings that come out of the price hike will go to the 70% of the population which has lower wages. So the money will be returned to that segment of society, and disproportionately it's wealthy people who are using large amounts of almost free gasoline in the country. But the argument in Iran is that the government carried this out very poorly. They did not inform people beforehand. The hike was very high. The price was static for 4 years, and then suddenly it went threefold. There are many criticisms of how the government carried this out. And parliamentarians are attacking the government. But in any case, it's generally accepted that the price of gasoline was too low. It's not benefiting ordinary people. But again, a clear distinction was made from day one about peaceful protesters. There were no attacks on the peaceful protesters. They left the scene after the rioters began, and the rioters were very violent. And as I said, in different cities, 5 police officers, at least 5 or 6, were murdered, and in different places, and I think that shows the magnitude of the violence.
Mohammad Marandi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us from Tehran.